Hey, podcast listener, listen, sometimes I record things and I don't like them. It's a weird thing to say, it's a weird thing to admit. But I worked hard on this week's Walt Disney World Word of the Week episode. I recorded it, I worked on the editing, I put the music in, and then before I released it, I listened to it and I didn't like it. I didn't like it at all. So I scrapped it, that's gone. But that doesn't mean there's no Word of the Week show this week. Instead, I'm going to be bringing you one that I did before. And again, this is like the bonus episodes. It's no longer on Apple Podcasts. And it's one of my favorite Word of the Week episodes that I ever put out there. Please forgive the slowness in my delivery. Please forgive a little bit of the nerves. But once I get going on this one, there's a lot of really good information. It's a fun story. So grab a drink, grab a snack, and enjoy this week's Walt Disney World Word of the Week.
The Year to There podcast, it's time to start the show. Be sure to hold on tight, here we go. Exploring all the different Disney destinations. Year to There, it's time to start the fun.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Ear to There podcast, Walt Disney World Word of the Week. This is a complimentary Wednesday podcast to my already very famous Ear to There podcast that comes your way each and every Monday. So each week I'll be bringing you a new Walt Disney World word, and then I'll give you tips, tricks, history, news, all about that word. All right, let's get right into it. This week's Word of the Week is brought to you by the letter C. And while your first instinct might be C is for cookie because this sounds an awful lot like Sesame Street, this time, C is going to refer to Cornelius, as in Cornelius Vanderbilt Wood. So yeah, at the intro, I promised you a little history sometimes. This podcast about Cornelius Vanderbilt Wood is going to give you a little bit of history about Disneyland and the Walt Disney Company. Now you may be saying to yourself, who is Cornelius Vanderbilt Wood? Or as he was known, C.V. Wood, or by his nickname, Woody. And no, I don't mean Woody from Toy Story. I'm not talking about Tom Hanks. So would you believe it if I told you that C.V. Wood had just about as much to do with the building of the first ever theme park, Disneyland, as Walt Disney did himself? You probably wouldn't believe me. You're saying right now, well, okay, sure, but I've never heard of this guy. That's exactly the point. Barely anyone has ever heard of Cornelius Vanderbilt Wood. And that's why I wanted to talk about him in this podcast. See, I'm a huge Disney fan and somewhat of a amateur Disney historian. I've read countless books on the company's history, on animation, on Walt Disney himself. I've read every biography of Walt Disney I could get my hands on. And guess what? None of them mention this guy, C.V. Wood. Or at least none of them mention him very much as far as his involvement with the Disney company and with Disneyland goes. The way I found about Cornelius Vanderbilt Wood is a few years ago, I was reading an old archived article about a theme park that was opening in the Bronx in New York in June of 1960. It was called Freedomland USA, and it bore a striking resemblance to the original Disneyland. I mean, striking. Okay, this park, it didn't last very long. It was shuttered by 1964. But when I dug a little deeper into its origins, I was blown away that I had never heard of its creator's story before. So C.V. Wood was born on December 17th, 1920 in Texas. As a young man, he worked as a director of industrial engineering for an aircraft manufacturer in his home state of Texas. Later, he was hired by the Stanford Research Institute, where he worked as an engineer and as an outside consultant to Walt Disney himself, helping with the logistics of the anticipated Disney theme park. So Walt Disney was so impressed by Wood's intelligence and problem-solving capabilities that he offered him a job as a supervisor on the construction of Disneyland. I know, right? I mean, could you imagine being the supervisor of the construction of Disneyland early on? So Walt and Woody, C.V. Wood, were both fiery, really passionate people, and it got close very, very quickly. Walt Disney really trusted Wood, and he named him Disneyland's very first employee. So Wood not only supervised the construction of the park, he actually was the one who chose the site among the orange groves of Anaheim, and he was in charge of purchasing the land where the theme park was eventually built. And it was C.V. Wood, as president and general manager of Disneyland, who gave President Nixon the key to Disneyland in August of 1955, 1 month before the grand opening of the park. So if you're anything like me and you've never heard of this guy before, it doesn't make any sense, right? I mean, how could a man who was so deeply involved with the construction and creation of Disneyland, a man who Walt Disney often referred to as his son, be totally left out of all the Disney history books and films? I mean, why doesn't Cornelius Vanderbilt Wood have a window on Main Street in Disneyland? I mean, this was the park where he was incredibly instrumental in making a reality. So the answer to that question is a little bit of a complicated one. Not long after Disneyland opened, C.V. Wood was gone. Not only was he out as Disneyland's vice president and general manager, he was wiped clean from all the historic accounts of the Disney company as well. Walt and his older brother Roy, who's another key figure, huge key figure in the history of the Disney company, but that story for another podcast. So they fired Wood reportedly after a heated argument. It's not really known what that argument was about, and neither Walt Disney nor his brother Roy ever went public with the reason behind Wood's firing. I mean, that didn't stop people from speculating. There were rumors that Wood had embezzled money from the Disneys, but there was never any legal proceedings or records that would prove that as a fact. Other people speculated that Wood was fired for taking too much public credit for the building of Disneyland, or he was fired because he was designing other theme parks behind Walt Disney's back. But whatever the reason, Wood's relationship with the Disney company ended swiftly and with no fanfare. It was like one day C.V. Wood was in the Disneyland offices holding meetings, and the next day he was gone and never spoken of again. So once he was fired from Disney, C.V. Wood went on to head several other amusement park projects around the country, including Magic Mountain in Colorado in 1958 and Pleasure Island in Boston in 1959. Neither of those parks had very much financial success, though, and they were closed within a couple of years. Wood then went on to call himself the master planner of Disneyland, a title that, honestly, he probably somewhat deserved. But then a lawsuit from the Disney company squashed his hopes of earning any more money or fame from the Disneyland name. When Freedomland USA opened in the Bronx in 1964, it seemed that C.V. Wood was finally going to achieve the fame and fortune that Walt Disney had achieved with Disneyland's opening in 1955. The park was made up of several themed lands, including Little Old New York, Chicago, which had daily shows that depicted the Chicago Fire of 1871, the Great Plains, San Francisco, the Old Southwest, New Orleans, Mardi Gras, and Satellite City, the future. If any of these ideas sound a little bit familiar, they really should. They were designed an awful lot like Disneyland's themed lands, as Wood was trying to create an East Coast version of the popular West Coast tourist destination. Actually, on the day that Freedomland USA opened, The Ed Sullivan Show hosted a preview of the new park, calling it Disneyland's equal on the East Coast. And crazily enough, the next day, traffic was backed up so badly in the Bronx, with cars trying to get to the park, that Freedomland USA had to stop selling park tickets. That does kind of sound like Disneyland's opening day, doesn't it? With traffic coming to a standstill all over Anaheim. Unfortunately, that's kind of where the comparisons ended. The initial success, though, of the East Coast Disneyland was very short-lived. And by the end of its first year of operation, Freedomland USA was already over $8 million a day. $8 million in the 60s was an awful lot of money. So after a few more struggling years, the park was met with the extremely tough competition of the 64 World's Fair, which, by the way, Walt Disney had a big hand in creating. Maybe that was his ultimate retribution to his old pal C.V. Wood. And then Freedomland USA filed for bankruptcy and was later torn down. On the site in the Bronx where the park once stood now stands Co-op City, which is a large residential development, and the Bay Plaza Shopping Center. A plaque was installed in 2013 commemorating the theme park that once stood at that location. So then, after his most ambitious and largest theme park was shut down, good old Woody did achieve some fame and fortune when he moved the London Bridge from London to Arizona and opened it up as a tourist attraction. He was actually then hired by Warner Brothers, where he worked until his death in 1992. To this day, the Disney company does not acknowledge any link to Wood, and his existence is completely wiped out of the official history of Disneyland and the Disney company. It's pretty doubtful that anyone will know the true reason why Wood and Walt Disney had the big falling out that they did, as almost everyone who knew either man isn't around to tell their stories anymore. But just remember, the next time you're in Disneyland or Walt Disney World, that Walt Disney was in fact a genius and a visionary. Disneyland was his dream project, it was his creation, and one of his greatest accomplishments. But also remember, Walt Disney had a little bit of help in realizing his dream. And that help's name was Cornelius Vanderbilt Wood. I really hope you enjoyed this week's episode. I know I was completely blown away by the story of Cornelius Vanderbilt Wood when I first heard it. So I hope maybe I told you guys something that you hadn't ever heard before on this episode. So thank you so much for listening. And if you did enjoy it, please tell someone about the show. Tell your neighbor, tell your cousin, tell your grandma, or mum, as we say in Philadelphia, or mima, or however you pronounce it. I'd really appreciate you spreading the word, and thank you so much in advance for doing that. And just remember, there will be a new Walt Disney World Word of the Week each and every Wednesday morning. And also keep an eye out for the regular Ear to There podcast each and every Monday morning. And actually, both podcasts can be found in one place, so you only have to subscribe once, and you will get both podcasts sent to your feed each and every week. So until next week, thanks again for listening. Have a great week. Bye-bye.
Ear to there.